We're diving into a case today that really flips the script on the idea of, safe spaces, Gulfport, Florida in 1984, a quiet town
Hmm.
where you'd think nothing could go wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting how our perceptions of safety, I think, can sometimes blind us to the reality that danger can really lurk anywhere,
Yeah.
even in the most, seemingly idyllic settings.
Right, and that's what makes this case so unsettling. Our listener, is fascinated by true crime and psychology, and boy, this story has both in spades. We're going to try to unravel the murder of Karen Gregory, a 36-year-old graphic designer just visiting her boyfriend.
What's particularly intriguing about this case is that there was no forced entry at the crime scene, which immediately raises questions about the victim's relationship with the perpetrator.
So let's set the scene. It's May 22nd, 1984. Karen's alone at her boyfriend's house while he's out of town for business. And neighbors report hearing a woman screaming that night, but no one calls the police.
This really highlights the psychological phenomenon known as the bystander effect. It's a chilling example of how people often hesitate to intervene in emergencies, assuming someone else will take action or convincing themselves that they're misinterpreting the situation.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen, especially in a close-knit community where
Yeah.
people might assume it's a domestic dispute or something they shouldn't get involved in.
Exactly.
Mm.
But the tragic reality is that in a crisis, every second counts. And this case serves as a stark reminder that we can't afford to be passive bystanders. If you sense something is wrong, trust your instincts. Even a simple phone call to the police could make all the difference.
It's heartbreaking to think that a single phone call might have saved Karen's life. It wasn't until the next morning that her body was discovered by a friend. The scene was horrific. Multiple stab wounds, signs of a struggle.
The brutality of the attack suggests a personal motive, someone filled with rage. And the lack of forced entry pointed investigators towards someone Karen knew, or who had easy access to the house.
So naturally, suspicion falls on the boyfriend, David Mackey, right?
That's the logical first step. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a solid alibi. He was out of town on business that night, confirmed by witnesses and travel records.
So if the boyfriend's ruled out, then who does that leave? It sounds like the investigation hit a dead end.
Not quite. Remember, the lack of forced entry suggests someone Karen trusted. And as the saying goes, sometimes the most helpful-seeming individuals are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Enter George Lewis, the seemingly helpful neighbor.
Okay, I remember reading about him. He was a volunteer firefighter, even helped with the search for Karen's killer.
And that's what makes cases like this so chilling. The perpetrator often inserts themselves into the investigation. Sometimes it's a conscious tactic to deflect suspicion, but sometimes it's a subconscious psychological compulsion to be close to the action, perhaps seeking a sense of control or power.
Wow, it's creepy. But wouldn't that draw attention to them? It seems incredibly risky.
It can be. But often these individuals are skilled at blending and appearing helpful and concerned. They believe they can outsmart the investigators, but they often make crucial mistakes.
So how did investigators start to see through George's facade? What were the red flags?
Well, as they pieced together the timeline of events and interviewed witnesses, inconsistencies began to emerge in George's story. For example, he claimed he had walked past Karen's house and noticed a light on, but his timeline didn't match up with other witness statements or the evidence found at the scene.
Ah, so it was those little details that started to unravel his carefully constructed story. It's like in those detective shows where they notice a tiny detail that doesn't add up, and that leads them down the rabbit hole.
Exactly. It's the meticulous work of investigators paying attention to those inconsistencies that often leads to the breakthrough in a case. They didn't dismiss those discrepancies, they dug deeper. And that's when the physical evidence came into play.
I'm curious about that. What kind of physical evidence did they find?
Well, remember those fibers I mentioned earlier? It turns out fibers are like microscopic fingerprints. By analyzing their type color and composition, investigators can link a suspect to a crime scene. And in this case, fibers found at the scene matched those from George Lewis's clothing.
Okay, that's pretty damning, but couldn't he argue that he'd been there earlier in the day or something?
He could try. But the prosecution also presented evidence of a bloody footprint found at the scene which matched George's shoe size and tread pattern. It's like a puzzle. Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, contributes to the bigger picture. And in this case, those pieces were starting to form a very incriminating picture of George Lewis.
So from helpful neighbor to potential suspect, I imagine that shift in perception must have been incredibly unsettling for the community.
Absolutely. This wasn't some stranger lurking in the shadows. This was someone they knew, someone they trusted. It shattered their sense of security and made them question their assumptions about those around them.
And I bet the media had a field day with this, right? A seemingly upstanding firefighter accused of such a brutal crime.
Oh, absolutely. The case quickly became a media sensation, capturing the public's imagination. It was a classic example of how crimes that shatter our expectations of normalcy often grab hold of the public consciousness. And the prosecution was ready to capitalize on that attention, using both the forensic evidence and George's behavior following the crime to build their case.
It's fascinating how these cases often become bigger than just the crime itself. They tap into our collective anxieties and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature.
Yeah, you're right. And this case really underscores that point. Here we have a seemingly upstanding citizen, a volunteer firefighter, no less accused of a brutal murder. It challenges our assumptions about who we can trust and where danger might lurk.
And speaking of uncomfortable truths, the whole bystander effect element is really unsettling. It makes you wonder, would I have the courage to act if I were in those neighbors' shoes?
It's a question we should all ask ourselves. The bystander effect is a powerful psychological phenomenon that can paralyze us in moments of crisis. We assume someone else will take action, or convince ourselves we're misinterpreting the situation. But as we've seen in this case, that hesitation can have tragic consequences.
So how do we overcome that? What can we do to make sure we don't become passive bystanders?
Well, the first step is awareness. Recognizing that the bystander effect exists and understanding how it can influence our behavior is crucial. And then it's about consciously choosing to act, even if it feels uncomfortable or risky. Remember, you don't have to be a hero. Sometimes a simple phone call to the police is all it takes to make a difference.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel overwhelmed or think that our actions won't matter. But in reality, even small acts of courage can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to challenge the social norms that often contribute to the bystander effect. We need to create a culture where speaking up, intervening, and looking out for one another is not only encouraged, but expected.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the trial itself. You mentioned earlier that the prosecution focused on both the forensic evidence and George Lewis's behavior. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, the prosecution presented a compelling narrative that portrayed George not just as someone who was present at the crime scene, but as someone who actively tried to cover his tracks and manipulate the investigation. They highlighted those inconsistencies in his story, the fibers matching his clothing, and that damning footprint.
I remember reading about him volunteering to help with the search. That seems like a pretty bold move for someone trying to hide their involvement.
Exactly. The prosecution argued that it was a calculated tactic to deflect suspicion and make himself appear helpful and concerned. They painted a picture of someone who was not only capable of violence, but also of deliberate deception.
But couldn't the defense argue that his helpfulness was genuine? That he was just a good Samaritan trying to do the right thing?
They certainly tried. The defense emphasized George's good character, his reputation in the community, and his lack of a prior criminal record. They argued that the prosecution's case was purely circumstantial, that the evidence didn't definitively prove he was the killer.
So it essentially boiled down to a battle of narratives. The prosecution's story of a calculated killer versus the defense's portrayal of a wrongly accused good guy.
Precisely. And it was up to the jury to decide which narrative they found more credible.
And speaking of the jury, this was back in 1986, long before the era of CSI and DNA analysis. I'm curious, how much did the prosecution's case rely on forensic science?
Well, while forensic science was not as advanced as it is today, it still played a crucial role in the case. Fiber analysis and footprint comparison were relatively new techniques at the time, but they provided tangible evidence linking George Lewis to the crime scene. The prosecution highlighted the significance of these findings, arguing that they corroborated the inconsistencies in his story and his suspicious behavior.
So even though they didn't have the sophisticated tools we have today, they were still able to use science to help build their case.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to consider how differently this case might have been investigated today. With advancements like DNA analysis and other forensic technologies, the evidence against George Lewis could have been even more overwhelming.
It makes you wonder what other clues might have been overlooked, or what additional evidence might have been discovered with modern techniques.
Exactly. And this highlights the constantly evolving nature of forensic science.
Yeah.
Every new discovery, every new technique has the potential to revolutionize the way we investigate and solve crimes. It's a fascinating field, always pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
It's like a never-ending quest for truth, constantly refining our methods and understanding. And for someone like our listener who's clearly fascinated by both psychology and true crime, I imagine this case is a goldmine of insights.
You're right. This case offers a unique blend of psychological intrigue, forensic science, and legal drama. It's a reminder that even in the most seemingly quiet and safe communities, darkness can lurk, and the truth can be far more complex than we initially perceive.
And beyond the specifics of this case, it also raises broader questions about human behavior, our perceptions of safety, and the importance of vigilance and awareness.
You're hitting on a key point there. This isn't just a story about a murder. It's a story about the human condition, about our capacity for both good and evil, and about the choices we make in the face of challenging circumstances.
And speaking of choices, let's go back to the jury's decision. After hearing all the evidence, after weighing the prosecution's narrative against the defense's arguments, what was their verdict? Yeah, I imagine the tension in that courtroom must have been like thick, as they waited for the jury to come back.
Oh, absolutely. Weeks in testimony evidence,
Mm.
cross-examinations, it all came down to these 12 people to decide George's fate.
So what did they decide?
Guilty. In 1986, the jury found George Lewis guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
Wow, a life sentence. It's a heavy consequence. I imagine that brought some sense of closure, I guess, to Karen's family and friends, although I can't imagine it, ever really erases the pain of losing her so horrifically.
Yeah, you're right. There's no real closure when it comes to a loss like this.
Yeah.
But the verdict did provide, I think, a sense of justice being served and maybe some solace in knowing that the person responsible was held accountable.
And beyond the legal outcome, Karen's case also, serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance and awareness, even in seemingly safe environments.
It's a lesson that resonates really deeply,
Yeah.
especially for anyone interested in personal safety and, understanding the complexities of human behavior.
Uh-huh.
It highlights the fact that danger can lurk beneath a veneer of normalcy and that we can't always judge a book by its cover.
Yeah, it's chilling to think that someone you might consider a friend or neighbor could be capable of such violence. It really makes you question your assumptions about people.
And that's a healthy response, I think. Yeah. It's not about living in fear. It's about being aware of our surroundings, paying attention to those little cues that might indicate something is wrong.
You mentioned earlier how this case might have been investigated differently today, with the advancements in forensic science. What are some of the key advancements since 1984 that could potentially, impacted this case?
Well, DNA analysis, which was in its very early stages back then, is now a cornerstone of criminal investigations. Imagine if they'd been able to test the blood at the scene or any other biological material that they found. It could definitively link George to the crime or potentially ruled him out entirely.
Right, DNA evidence, it seems like that's often the thing that makes or breaks a case these days.
Absolutely. And beyond DNA, there's a whole array of new technologies and techniques that have just revolutionized forensic science. Things like digital forensics, which can analyze data from computers and smartphones, or advanced imaging techniques that can reveal hidden evidence or even reconstruct crime scenes in 3D.
It's really mind-boggling to think how far forensic science has come in just, a few decades. It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It really is. And the
Yeah.
pace of innovation is only accelerating. Who knows what tools investigators will have, in another 10 or 20 years.
It's exciting, but also a bit unsettling. Makes you wonder, are criminals becoming more sophisticated as well?
That's a valid concern for sure. It's a constant cat and mouse game, between law enforcement and those who break the law. But ultimately, I do believe that the pursuit of justice will always drive innovation and, push us to develop new ways to uncover the truth.
And that brings us back to the heart of this whole deep dive. It's not just about solving crimes, it's about seeking justice for victims like Karen and ensuring that those responsible are held accountable.
It's about learning from these cases, understanding the factors that contribute to these tragedies and working to prevent them from happening again.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the psychology of the bystander effect to the evolution of forensic science. It's been a fascinating journey, and I'm sure our listener has, picked up some valuable insights.
I agree. This case offers a unique window, I think, into the complexities of human behavior, the power of science, and that importance of seeking justice. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of corners, truth can be found. And we all have a role to play in making our communities safer and more just.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. Karen Gregory's story is a powerful reminder that vigilance and awareness are crucial. It's up to each of us to be observant, to trust our instincts, and to take action when we sense something is wrong. Remember, a single phone call and act of courage can make all difference.
And never underestimate the power of knowledge. The more we understand about the world around us, about human behavior, and the tools that are available to us, the better equipped we are to face challenges and make good decisions.
So stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Because in a world where appearances can deceive and danger can be anywhere, knowledge is our greatest weapon and our best defense.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.